Well, welcome. Thank you very much for having us here back for another year. My name's Kate Moss. I work for International Paint, and this is my glamorous assistant, Martin Bridge. We're here today to do a presentation on varnishing made easy, which, to be honest, is a bit of a lie because varnishing is never particularly easy. However, hopefully today we're going to impart some hints and tips on how to make your varnish last longer, how to get rid of dust, information that you can take away back to your varnishing, because sadly every boat pretty much has some bright work on, whether it's the washboards or handrails, so this is a sort of an annual task that everyone has to put up with, unfortunately. We're going to start off with surface preparation, whether or not you have to strip it all back or whether you can just do a sort of maintenance coat. After that, we're going to have a look at choosing your varnish, because you really need to tailor your varnish for where you're applying the varnish. Varnish application, so we'll do some practical application here to give you an idea of how best to apply it and what tools to use. And then have a look at troubleshooting, so it might be that you're getting dust all the time, or perhaps you're getting quite a dull finish, so you're losing the gloss, so we'll have a look at some of the reasons behind those. And then finally a little bit about repairs and in-service maintenance, and then a bit of a summary at the end. If you've got any sort of questions, if there's any time at the end, then please shout out. Alternatively, come and talk to us over at the international table at the end. Okay, to start off with, I'm going to start with removal or in-service maintenance. So having a look at the state of the varnish at the moment. Now, if you've got no bare wood showing, but it's just lost a little bit of gloss, that's when you need to do a maintenance coat. So varnish, when you buy it in the tin, there's what's called a UV absorber, or in some of the posher ones there's a HAL, which is a hindered aiming light stabiliser. To confuse everyone, I'm not quite sure why we put that name on the tin. But basically, you have a UV absorber in there, which absorbs the sun and kind of stops it degrading the varnish. There's only so much UV absorber in a tin of varnish, or in your coat of varnish. Once that UV absorber is spent, it's absorbed as much as it can cope with, then the varnish tends to dull off, and that's when the sunlight is actually attacking the varnish. When you start getting it dulling, you need to then put a maintenance coat on to top up your level of UV absorber. So if you've got no bare wood showing, you can get away with just sanding it down and putting a maintenance coat on, but we're going to talk about that more in a second. If you've got any kind of flaking or any kind of bare wood, I'm afraid you're going to have to take it all off. No matter how you prepare those bare areas or how many coats of varnish you put on the top, it's all going to be pretty weak underneath, and you're never going to get it to stick properly. So if it looks like this, or it's just wearing through in areas, then now is the time to take it off. So when it comes to taking off varnish, you've basically got three options. You've got chemical strippers, sanding down just with a DA or a block sander, and then you've got the hot air gun and the scraper. There's no right or wrong way for removing varnish, it's down to personal preference. Chemical stripping is great, but it's messy. You get the goo and it goes all down everywhere, can damage the gel coat or the paint depending on the stripping you use. It's also really nasty stuff. It's there to soften varnish, so you don't want it on your skin. If you're going to use it, make sure you wear these really thick marigold washing up gloves, not these sort of thin disposable gloves, because it'll go straight through. Also, it's really important, if you do use a chemical stripper, to make sure that you get rid of it all after it's done its job. So copious amounts of fresh water washing. Any chemical stripper that you have there, when you put the varnish over the top, will react with the varnish and it'll stop it drying, or it'll just go sort of a mushy mess. So copious amounts of cleaning, and be aware of health and safety, wear really clean, thick gloves. Quite a thin layer of varnish, then you're probably just better off just hitting it with a DA or a block sander. I would say hit it with 120 grit. 80 grit is going to be a little bit too harsh. On a bit of 80 grit sandpaper, you tend to have really quite big grit of sandpaper that's not very evenly dispersed, and you tend to scratch the wood and damage it rather than giving it a nice sort of even sand. 120 grit will be a much more evenly dispersed grit on the sandpaper, and you'll tend to just take it off evenly rather than hitting it with too hard a grit. DA sanding is going to be the easiest and the quickest. Block sanding would be the best and the kind of the nicest for the wood, but that's a sort of a real elbow work to block sand off sandpaper, varnish. A hot air gun and a stripper, a scraper, that's probably your easiest option. Top tips would be go for the lightest hot air gun you've got because you're going to spend a long time carrying it. In terms of strippers, they come in all scrapers. They come in all shapes and sizes. You get push ones, you get pull ones. Push ones, top tip would be to round off the edges so it doesn't gouge the wood. But to be honest, treat them as tools. Sharpen the edge, don't just chuck them into the toolbox. Give them a bit of a love and sort of attention, and they'll do the work for you. Have a variety of shapes and sizes, so you can get into those corners. A combination of all those three removal methods is sometimes used, especially if you've got varnish in the corners and it's really quite hard to get it out with a scraper. When you've taken off all of the varnish, the wood is still quite aged, especially if you've been hot air and scraping. You haven't really got rid of the aged layer of wood at the top. So you want to sand it with maybe 180 grit sandpaper. You might want to start with 120 grit, but then finish with up to 180 grit. Block sanding, always best. So that'll get rid of the aged layer of wood at the top. If you've got any mould spots in the wood, you've got to get rid of these. Dettol, mould spray, Polycell 3-in-1 mould cleaner, something like that. Just repeat until you get rid of all the mould stain. Choosing your varnish. So when you walk into the chandlery, you are confronted with a whole array of different varnishes, and they're all really quite different. You tend to have the options of a single pack or a 2-pack varnish, the majority being a single pack varnish. Within that single pack varnish, you have different types. So you have the traditional tongue oil based varnishes. So this tongue oil, this comes from trees. It's a very traditional, old school varnish type. It smells sort of like it should do. It's got the right amber hue, but it's quite old traditional technology. It is what it is. The marine based varnishes tend to be of far higher quality tongue oil than say the varnishes you get for your house. But it is what it is. It's very flexible. It takes a long time to dry, so that means it will nicely flow out and you won't get the brush marks. Slightly more modern varnishes are polyurethane based. So from us, we've got with the tongue oil, you have the original, which used to be called Blue Peter, and the slightly posher version of that is the schooner. So the schooner is it's got a better UV package in it, so more suntan lotion in there if you like. Back to the polyurethanes. Polyurethane varnish, the resin in a polyurethane varnish has been particularly formulated to do a particular job. So if you take, for instance, our compass varnish, this is all about hard wearing. It's got a really hard wearing resin in it. So it's great for areas of high wear and tear, steps, cockpits, boarding ladders, things like that. But, and it's very high, it's very quick drying. So to give you an example, a traditional tongue oil based varnish, that'll get to the kind of touch dry in the best part of the day. It'll take a long time to get to touch dry. Whereas the compass will take about 45 minutes. So if you're after something really quick, you can get 2 coats of that on in a day. The Schooner Gold, that's been formulated, the resin has been formulated to give you the most beautiful finish. So it's not got the scratch resistance that the compass has got, but it is going to last the longest and give you the most beautiful finish. So in areas where you only want to paint it once in a blue moon, and it's not going to get wear and tear, so maybe a hatch cover, something like that. Then you have something slightly strange, which is called a hybrid oil varnish. Now from us, this is a product called Woodskin, which is open, so I'm not going to pour it all over me. But this is a little bit like, imagine a tin of Dexoli and a tin of original varnish, and they're poured into one tin. So it's chock full of oil, which makes it really quite porous and breathable. So imagine you've got a painted wooden panel, and you've got a damage here, and the water gets in, and it goes under, and in a conventional varnish, it won't be able to get out from underneath the varnish, and it'll cause the varnish to come off. And quite often you see around a varnish, around a damage, the varnish just sort of comes off in sheets and the damage propagates out. With wood skin, the water will get in and get under, and then it'll be able to come out, so a damage stays as a damage. It's a great property. It means it's a kind of, almost like the person who wants to go out and sail, rather than spend most of their time doing their varnish. Also, because it's chock full of oil, you don't need to sand in between coats with something like a hybrid oil varnish, because it sort of all melds into, each coat sort of melts into the previous coat. The other type of varnish to think about is a matte or a satin varnish. Now, as soon as you start matting down varnish, you knock off the UV resistance. So if you use that outside, it'll really degrade really quickly. So we manufacture an interior grade matte, which we don't bother wasting money by putting UV additive in. So really, in the sort of the world of a satin or a matte, there really are only interior based varnishes. The top tip though, with a satin, is quite cloudy in the tin. We've got a tin here if anyone wants to come and have a look at it later. But it's really quite cloudy, and every layer that you put on, you sort of just create a layer of cloud upon cloud upon cloud. So then, after 5 or 6 layers, you almost can't see the grain. So the top tip is to build up with a gloss, and then overcoat the last couple of coats with a satin. Doing that means that you'll still be able to feel the warmth and the grain of the wood, but you'll get that satin finish. If you're looking for a satin for exterior, your kind of really only option is that hybrid oil varnish. Because there's so much oil in there, it's really quite a kind of a matte, satiny finish. And I'll pass around a panel shortly. The other type of varnish is a 2-pack varnish. This is the only real water white, completely clear, transparent varnish you can get from us. So all of our single pack varnishes have got this amber, traditional amber colour, whereas the Perfection Plus is completely water clear. 2-pack varnishes are really quite hard. They don't really flex, they don't give, compared to a single pack which really will flex with the wood. So if you've got a lot of joints where you've got a lot of movement, a 2-pack varnish is not for you. But the 2-pack varnishes, in terms of their scratch resistance, their gloss, kind of longevity, everything, they are kind of the top of the rung. But in terms of movement and flexibility, always go for a single pack if you've got a lot. In terms of the sort of choosing the varnish, it's really important to tailor that varnish to your end use. But once you've gone out and you've prepared, you've taken back the bare varnish, so assuming we're going with bare wood, you've taken back the varnish back to bare wood, you've gone out and you've bought your tin of varnish. Application wise, where do you need to think? So, before you start, the substrate. So you've got your bare wood, you sanded it with 180 grit, it's chock full of dust. The best way to get rid of the dust is to hoover it. After you've hoovered it, and actually in between coats, in between sanding, you can buy from chandleries, you can buy tack rags. And these are linseed oil sort of rags with linseed oil on them. They're quite tacky. I'll pass this round in a second. But they come in a packet like this, and I have to do the stages here because they take ages to fold out. But you then fold it out and it looks like this. A little bit more folding out, and you get to this, but you have to really pull them apart. And then ultimately, I feel like I'm doing some sort of magic trick here. You end up with this big long sheet, which the etiquette of tack rag use, and I'll show it a bit later, is you just ball it up and you smooth it over. So after you've hoovered and after you've solvent wiped, you then would tack rag, and this gets rid of any remaining dust. So you can see on here there's quite a lot of dust, even though this has been solvent wiped. I'm going to pass this round. The other top tip with tack rags is put them in a plastic bag so they stay quite moist and they don't dry out. Acetone. If you've got oily woods, you need to get rid of that oil. So something like teak, you need to get rid of the oil on the surface before putting varnish over the top, otherwise the varnish is never going to stick. So you need a fast evaporating, really quite strong solvent like acetone, and wipe that on. Give it a couple of wipes to make sure you get rid of all of the oil off the top surface. So you clean down your surface, that's going to minimise dust. You then have the problem with dust in your environment, so hoover everything. Dust is not your friend when it comes to varnishing. Literally make sure you are in a pristine environment. If in doubt, you can dampen down the floor. That will help with dust minimisation. Okay, the applicator. Now, Martin here today is my beautiful assistant. I bought him a size medium Tyvek suit. Then he came along and I realised he wasn't going to get into the size medium. The best way of varnishing is naked. Don't. But from a health and safety point of view, obviously we're not going to advise you varnish completely naked. You want to try and minimise dust on you, so wool jumpers, anything wool, anything that can create static is out of the question. Tyvek suits are really good because they are anti-static, and if you've been standing in them, hoover them down or choose a new one. It's all about trying to get rid of any sources of dust. Thank you for not getting naked. Okay, in terms of tools, what do you need to use? Brushes. We could literally talk for hours about brushes and badgers and all sorts of things, but very quickly, synthetic brushes now are so far improved from sort of 10 years ago that a synthetic brush is just as good as a natural bristle brush. What you're looking for is a really soft bird end. So you want a high quality, quite thin bristle, and as long as it really goes to a sort of a thin, fluffy end, then it's a good quality brush. So imagine these are all going to put brush marks in the varnish, and having the smaller, slightly softer ends will put in smaller brush marks, and the varnish won't have as much work to do flowing out. The other thing is it's going to be dusty. If you buy it, it'll be absolutely filthy. So clean it in solvent. You can spin it. You can't spin this. You can sort of bang it against the side of the table to get rid of the solvent in the dust. You want to clean it and then clean it again, and then probably clean it again to try and get your brush as dust free as possible. And then sort of treat it with respect. Make sure you clean it in between applications. There's various schools of thought of sort of suspending it in even a sort of a diesel mix, but I'm not sure about that. So I just suspend it and don't let it dry, sort of tip down. A lot of people, when they're varnishing, will take the tin and dip their brush straight into the tin and then varnish out. You're going to be transferring any dust that you get on your brush straight into the tin. So the top tip is always to decant what you need and then apply it. Anything left over in that mixing pot you can either cover and use later, or you can have almost like a slops tin, which would be the varnish that you would thin down to use as the penetrating coats in subsequent applications. One thing I forgot to mention, and I do quite enjoy a little sample panel, so we're going to send these round. Back to the previous varnishes, never ever put a 2-pack varnish over a single pack varnish. This is the effect you'll get. The solvents in the 2-pack paint are really, really harsh, and they'll eat into the single pack paint, or the same applies to paint as it does to varnish. So never put a 2-pack product over a single pack product. Okay, so drying. The easiest way to paint out washboards or something like that is horizontal. Apply the varnish and it'll flow out nicely. However, any airborne dust is just going to sit straight onto that panel. If you can, suspend it vertically, either suspend it or sort of wedge it up against something. The airborne dust you won't get as much airborne dust. So it is all about dust minimisation, which is a bit of a nightmare. You can often, actually, with your tack rags even, you can make a little sort of cupboard for your panel. So literally by opening the tack rag out and draping it over a box, you can put your panel in to dry, and the tack rag will pick out the airborne dust. So, onto the exciting bit, varnish application. Right, so Martin's going to be making some mixes here. The first mix he's going to make is the penetrating mix. So, you've got we're going to just talk about conventional single pack varnishes for a second. So you've got your bare wood, and on top of that I've put a good couple of coats of this penetrating varnish. So this is a mix of 50-50 varnish to thinners number 1. So the reason we're using thinners number 1 and not normal white spirit is that thinners number 1 is a really refined and dried white spirit. So often if you use just normal white spirit, it has a lot of moisture in it, and that has two issues. One, it stops it drying, it really slows down the drying, and that then can sort of dull the surface. Also, because it takes a long time to dry, you tend to get even more dust in it. I make my mum use thinners number 1 rather than white spirit, so and if I could get away with, her using something cheaper, then I'd let her, but no, definitely always thinners number 1. So just in the mixing cup here, he's just mixing it up. We had to steal the mixing sticks from the Westman, thank you very much. Forgot to put them in the car this morning. Okay, so we're going to apply this mix to a bare panel. The idea is that you really want to push this into the grain. So I use either a foam roller or a brush. And now those little Jenny brushes, the foam brushes, they're great, but you can't really put too much pressure on them to sort of, you really want to push that varnish in. It's got to sink into the grain. If you've got a really tight grained wood, then you definitely need to go for the 50-50 mix, because it needs to be thin enough to get into that tight grain. If you've got quite a wide, thicker grain, you can get away with slightly less thinners in there. So we're just going to apply this, being careful not to get it all over ourselves. So as you can see, it's literally like water. So you'll just be working it in and making sure, really the idea is that you don't get any pooling, so no sort of really thick layers. And then leave it to dry for a day. And then your next penetrating coat, I'd go with 25% thinners and 75% varnish. So we have a panel here which has had the 50% and the 25% wash on. So I'm going to pass this round. So you can see you're already starting to get the sort of the varnish look, but it's really penetrating into the wood. If you weren't to apply this penetrating layer, the varnish would just be sitting on the top. You'd have quite a lot of air gaps in the grain where it hasn't sunk in. Okay, so after your penetrating wash coats, I would just sand that lightly with a 280 grit. You just want to sort of take the nibs off. And then you're starting to put what I call the grain fill coats on. So there's various schools of thought about whether or not you thin varnish. I would only ever thin varnish if it was a really, really hot day and you want it to stay slightly open so it could flow out a little bit longer. Or it was really cold and it needed a little bit more to make it flow because it's sort of a bit solid. So Martin here, this is just Compass, original, unthinned, so you can see the nice sort of amber hue. So the polyurethane based varnishes have this same amber hue. Now this has been solvent wiped down a couple of times, and then I'm just going to tack rag. So when you tack rag, you don't want to put on too much pressure because you don't want any of this linseed oil to come off onto the surface you're coating. So we'll talk a little bit about wet edges in a second, but just for argument's sake, I'm going to pretend that this bit down here is the previous coated area. So when it comes to applying these grain fill coats, and in fact any subsequent coat, I'd really load the brush up. I'm going to do it this other way. Load the brush up, put on obviously easier horizontal because I am literally getting everywhere, and get on enough that you then start to sort of spread it out. So do this in a sort of a Union Jack technique, diagonally, horizontally, vertically, and then diagonally. And I've not got enough on to meet that wet edge, so I'll just put a bit more down here. So again, doing a bit of a spreading out. So you want to sort of really lay it on quite thickly, and then your final move is to almost stretch it out. So remember, I've got the old first bit that I've applied down here. So I work from the middle of the bit that I've just applied, and I stretch it out and feather it into the previous area that I coated. So it's always stretching from the middle and really stretch it out. So this means you're feathering this bit out, so when you put your next section on, you're feathering into it. And you can actually see, if you look along the panel, you can see if you've missed any bits, and you can physically sort of see it pulling out. So you want to get enough on there that it can flow out and give you gloss, but not too much that you get sags. These grain fill coats, you'll learn about the product, you'll get a feel for how much you can put it on without it sagging. So, gone round once, I then leave it and move on. I wouldn't go back, if I saw any sags, I wouldn't go back. As soon as you start, after a couple of minutes, as soon as you start going back and touching up, you're going to get horrendous brush marks because the varnish isn't going to have enough time to flow out. Right, we'll leave that for now. So, I'm working on a good 3 or 4 grain fill coats. You really want to sand in between coats with 320. When you start applying the grain, so imagine this is a cross section through your bit of wood, and you've got the grain and you've got your varnish sitting in that grain. You're going to be putting varnish on the top bits as well as the sort of the wells of the grain, and you're never going to get rid of that grain effect unless you sand down the tops of those high bits of grain. So you want a really hard sand in the grain fill stages to give you that sort of super finish, like a piano sort of finish. When you sand down, you kind of want to get that white powder. You don't just want to give it a sort of a scratch. You really want to take off the varnish, and you'll, after maybe your 3rd or 4th coat, you'll start seeing that you don't get any of the wells anymore. You're getting this really super flat surface. If you don't, this here is a varnish, an idea, a slight example of a varnish panel that's a little bit more grainy. You can pass that around. So after your 3 or 4 coats, sanding in between with 320 grit, you then need to look at your finished coat. So this is the final, the beautiful coats. So exactly the same process. Union jack and then stretch it out. Sanding in between, you can, at this stage, I would lift it up to maybe 400 grit. If you sand in between with any higher grit, you then start to polish the surface, and that's when you start to fail adhesion-wise with the subsequent coats. So if you go for 600 grit, for instance, when you put the next coat on, it's not really got anything to grip onto. So 400 grit is sufficient for you not to be able to see the grain, but it's enough for the next coat to grip in. We have a panel here which gives you an example of varnishing with sanding in between the 2 harsher grit. Unfortunately, it's easier to see outside, but if you have a look, you can just see the swirls of the DA sander. Now again, if you were a proper sort of a die-hard varnisher, you would be block sanding. It's hard to beat a DA sander for quickness. Okay, moving on to a hybrid oil varnish, wood skin. Do you want to pour that out? I'm going to show you, this is quite, it's almost a bit like cold gravy in terms of its consistency. If you're in a particularly cold environment, then it's really quite bodied in the tin. And can everyone see that it's sort of glooping out quite a lot? So when you apply a product like this, it's really hard to put it on in a nice thin layer. Top tip for using wood skin is to add just a capful of white spirit. And in this instance, I probably would let my mum use normal white spirit. If you add just a tiny bit of white spirit and give it a good mix, you'll knock the viscosity down a treat. Another top tip, and there's a lot of schools of thought on this, is whether or not you stir or shake the tin. Shaking, I personally, I'd give it a shake, but I'd then leave it for half an hour for the bubbles to dissipate. So, wood skin, again, the same sort of application. Have we got any brushes here? The nice thing with the hybrid oil varnish is that you don't need to sand between coats. If you want to get a much more grain fill effect, you can sand between the third and fourth coat. With this sort of product, it'll take quite a long time to dry, and it'll carry on over sort of the space of 3 or 4 weeks, really sort of firming up. It's quite cheesy to start with. So wood skin was used on hand Beaulieu, I think, wasn't it, on all of the handrails? It's as easy as that. If anyone wants to have a look at the consistency of this, then do come up and have a look at the end. Okay, just a quick summary. You've got your penetrating coats, a good couple of coats. After that I would sand with 280 grit. Then you've got a good 3 or 4 grain fill coats, sanded with 320. You might have to drop down to 240, but as long as you finish with 320 in the grain fill coats, and you really want a white sand to get rid of the top so you can start getting your grain filled. Then you've got a good 3 coats of your finished coat, sanding 400 grit between coats. Okay, so that's the theory of the application. So the hybrid oil, 3 or 4 coats, you don't need to sand in between. It really is a lot more labour saving. One quick thing to mention, on handrails and anything with a sort of concave shape, when you sand in between coats, you tend to apply more pressure on the edges, and that's where you start to get varnish wear through. That'll be where it first fails. So make sure that you build up the thickness of varnish on those areas. Also, if you've got any sharp edges, the varnish will pull away from those edges, so again, make sure you put enough on those edges. It is all about getting enough product on there. If you only have 3 or 4 coats, it will fail within a year, probably. You're going to run out of UV absorber, and it's just too thin, really, to cope with sort of water and everything else. So it will fail. So be conscious when you're sanding not to over sand on the edges or on the concave sort of radius edges. This is an example on the screens of that exact problem. I think it was after about 6 months where it's worn through. So there's just not enough product. So that is one of the main issues with varnishing, is that people don't put enough on. And then you get premature failure. I'm going to quickly run through some troubleshooting that we tend to hear of quite a lot. The first is air bubbles. 99.999% of the time, that is dust. And dust is not your friend. If when you paint it out or varnish it when you apply it, you see a lot of dust. That is either dust on the brush or dust in the tin. So make sure you clean the brush before use. If you paint it out and it's looking absolutely beautiful, and then you come back in half an hour and it's covered in dust, that tends to be airborne dust. So think about your environment, think about damping down or building that little container that you can put it in. Never brush paint from the tin is in there too, yes, as we said, always tip the can top. The next issue is brush marks. I would say environment is probably to blame there. So either it's too hot, you're painting in direct sunlight, or it's too cold. If it's a really cold day, warm your varnish first. Don't put it on the cooker to boil, but just put it in a, we have seen that, just put it in a sink full of warm water, or just keep it somewhere warm, like near a radiator, or just inside. So that will help it just flow out. In terms of ideal environment, it's around 20 degrees C, not in direct sun. Paint when the wood is sort of, well, you sometimes get gassing from wood depending on the type and depending on the time of day. So that could be an area where you're getting air bubbles from. Overworking the varnish, so it only has a certain amount of time before it can flow out, before it sort of gets too dry to carry on flowing. So that might be an issue for your brush marks. Wet edge. When you apply your varnish, this edge is what we call the wet edge. So this is, you need to consider your wet edge when you're planning your route, if you like. So if I was going to apply varnish to this boat here, I'm just going to walk over here, you might start down here, and then you've got the trouble of having a wet edge here and a wet edge up here. So you've got to keep both of those wet edges going, otherwise you'll end up with a mark where you're trying to get that wet edge back to sort of blend it in with the next application. So applying here, you'd have that issue. Applying up here, you'd also have the issue of two wet edges. You need to think about where you start and think about how you can keep that sort of going. So I'd start down here where you've got something you can sort of start off, and I'd go along here and then up here, taking in that area, along and down, and then I'd come back and do this bit in the middle. So you can almost disguise your wet edge here and here. It's not too obvious. Whereas if you were to start round here and then go all the way round back there, you'd have a horrendous brush marky mess there, where you haven't blended in those edges. If I was going to apply this, I would get a friend to help. Okay, quite often you'll struggle if you see grain fill. If you see grain fill during your application, you're struggling. What I mean by grain is literally sort of a weavy, it's all in the grain and you're not getting a nice flat piano finish. If that's during the application, that's because you haven't done that hard white sand back. You haven't got rid of the tops off the high bits of the grain. If it's maybe 3 or 4 weeks down the line, and what you had to start with was this beautiful panel, and you go back after 3 or 4 weeks, it's really shrunk back. That's really down to too fast application. And in terms of the solvent that's in there, it's taken 3 or 4 weeks to fully sort of evaporate out, and that's when the varnish has started to sort of shrink back into the grain. If that's the case, I would then just hit it with 320 and finishing up to 400, and then apply another couple of finish coats. One thing though, I'm nearly finished, one thing to note is that when you do those hard sands, you're taking off varnish off the top areas, and that's where if you don't put enough on, you're going to get premature failure. It's all about getting enough varnish on. In terms of in-service maintenance, so I mentioned earlier, if it's just a bit dull, a little bit sort of lost its gloss, knock it back with 320 grit, and then just apply a couple of coats over the top. You really want to be doing that and sort of keeping on top of it rather than having to remove it all. If you've got any damages, the best option is to repair as soon as you can before any water can get in and cause any damage. So I would spot sand those areas and build up the layers, and then because you're never going to be able to blend in that edge, I would coat that whole area with 1 or 2 fresh coats and take it out to somewhere where you can sort of hide the line. So it might be the edge of a window, or it might just be a sharp corner where you can run a bit of masking tape down and you can sort of hide the edge of that repair. So in summary, maintenance is far less time consuming than completely taking it all off and having to start from scratch. Keep on top of it, and when it starts dulling down, put another maintenance coat over the top. We all would love to be in nice sunny weather, but actually the fact that it's not sunny all the time is making our varnish last longer, so it's a benefit of being in the UK. Paint indoors where you can control the temperature and the dust, or wait for nice weather. Plan your application before starting. Don't just go for it and then you'll have the issue with the wet edge. Keep dust to a minimum and tack rag between coats. So that'll really pick up any extra dust. Don't shake the can, or if you do, make sure you leave it for the bubbles to dissipate. Don't garnish from the can, pour it into a mixing cup. Warm the varnish on a cold day. More coats is better protection, and look out for those radius edges. And if you do it properly, you can end up with something like this, and be the envy of the marina. That was about 10 coats, and a lot of time and boxes made to put it in. Thank you very much. One thing to quickly note though, in reality, you're never going to get a finish that is completely dust free. And up here, we've got some panels where you can see little specks of dust, but actually, if you look up close, you can see it and you'll probably be a little bit disappointed. But from about 1 metre away, you won't see anything. Manage expectations. Don't expect to achieve absolutely no dust. You're always, in whatever environment you paint in, you're always going to get dust. But you won't be able to see it really from about 1 metre away. Thank you very much.